the person behind the Infrequent Flyers independent bottling. So before I get into more information about the company, I want to get straight into the first whiskey, because there's nothing worse than a whiskey tasting when you have to wait about 15 minutes before you actually get to the first dram. What I would say is, if anybody has any, I love questions. So if anybody wants to ask anything at any point, please do not hesitate to do so. Just shout out or type a message or whatever. All questions are good. So please do not be shy. But let's I'll come back and talk a little bit more about the company. But let's kick off with the first whiskey, which is a Linkwood 14-year-old. This is actually from our most recent bottling, which was batch number 5 of Infrequent Flyers, which we did in October. Since we started the company, we've bottled, I think, 38 different casks. This was the 31st, and Linkwood's a great whiskey. I know from speaking to other independent bottlers that it's one of those whiskies that is very, very popular with independent bottlers. There's probably 2 reasons for that. One is that it's such a big distillery. I mean, Linkwood produces between 5 and 6 million litres of alcohol per annum. So it is one of the bigger distilleries in Scotland. The beauty of that, from my point of view, is that it means that you actually get an opportunity to purchase some of those casks. So the bigger the distillery, the more excess stock is available. So the more chance for an independent bottler to get access to those casks. But more importantly, Linkwood is just a very, very nice whiskey. It's consistently of a good quality, especially, you know, if you're buying it directly from the distillery. I have to say, you know, in my experience, the Diageo distilleries tend to have a pretty solid cask program. You know, they're using decent quality wood, so you're not getting like third or fourth fill casks. You're getting first and second fill hogsheads and barrels. So you're getting a really nice influence on the cask there. What we've done with this particular Linkwood, this was actually re-racked by myself approximately 1 year ago. So we transferred it from a refill hogshead into a virgin oak barrel. So basically taking fresh American oak that has never had anything in it before and exposing the whiskey to that type of wood. So typically what you're doing there is giving a Scotch whiskey the type of wood process that would normally be kept for an American whiskey. I'm sure you guys know that in the US, typically, it might be by law, the whiskies have to be filled into, certainly for bourbon, I think the whiskies have to go into brand new oak. Whereas in Scotland, we typically use second-hand casks. So what we're doing here is almost applying the American process to a Scotch whiskey. And virgin oaks, I've got to say, probably one of my top 3 or 4 types of cask to work with. I first came across virgin oak when I was working with Ben Riach, and we used to put quite a high or re-rack quite a high percentage of our whiskies into fresh virgin American oak. So typically, if we were bringing out say a Ben Riach 16-year-old, which I don't think you can get anymore, but with the old Ben Riach 16, there would have been a cask formula there that had a percentage of virgin oak, a percentage of bourbon barrel, and a percentage of maybe sherry cask. And that virgin oak was always a really nice component. You didn't need to use a lot of whiskey from virgin oak, because it has a much quicker and bigger impact on the malt than it would if it was like a refill bourbon barrel. So those the kind of things that you get from American oak, which are typically vanilla and honey and caramel and shortbread, those sort of components are much enhanced when you use a virgin American oak cask. So that's kind of what you'll get coming through on this one.
So Alistair, do you know how much time this finish was?
Yeah, it's roughly 1 year, roughly 1 year, Gal. I think this was from. We've been doing a lot of re-racking. We started our re-racking. So I started the business in 2018, and the first re-rack program started in April 2019. And we've done 6 re-rack programs so far. Now, when I talk about re-racking, basically that's what some people would call finishing. So taking some of the liquid and putting it into different types of cask. The whiskies on this tasting, there's actually 3 of them that have gone through a re-rack program under our stewardship. And I think they were all done on the second re-rack, which was sort of September, October of 2019. So that's the Linkwood, the Glentalkers, and the Orkney were all put into their finishing cask round about the same time. So they've all had about a year. And it's kind of interesting because the first 2 batches of casks that we bottled, and there was 17 casks in total. They were all in the original cask because nothing that we had re-racked had spent enough time in the second cask at that point. But once we got to batches number 3, 4, and 5, which this whiskey comes from, suddenly we're able to access some of those casks where we've done some finishing and some re-racking because they've had enough time. And now they're ready to go. So to come back to the Linkwood, it's been in the virgin oak for round about one year before it was bottled. So yeah, you get a lot of that kind of vanilla, toffee, a little bit of marzipan coming through as well. Kind of toast.
Quite spicy as well.
What was that? Somebody have a question there? No. Little bit of kind of creme caramel and sort of toasted marshmallows as well.
And I could say also like brown butter.
Brown butter. Yeah. Yeah, that kind of creamy sort of character that comes through. There's kind of an interesting story behind this one as well. This cask was actually a sort of a last minute substitute for there was the original cask that was going to be bottled was a different Linkwood. We had a Linkwood that had been in a Marsala wine hogshead, and that was the cask that I had intended to bottle. And the guys at the distillery, we had actually picked all the casks out that were going to get moved down to the bottler, and the guys at the distillery phoned me and said, "Look, there's a bit of a problem here. The Marsala cask that you picked out is only about a quarter full, and it should have been about 3/4 full, based on the figures that we had." And it turns out that basically, for the last year, this Marsala cask had been leaking very, very slowly, to the point where we had lost, 2/3 of the liquid content of the cask, and what was left was too small to justify a bottling. So I had to very quickly find a good replacement. Unfortunately, there was one or two other liquid casks from the same parcel that we were able to turn to. But it goes to show you, and this has actually happened to me 2 or 3 times already. You go to choose a cask from the warehouse, and you find out that the liquid content is a lot lower than you actually expect it to be. And unfortunately, that is just kind of one of the problems that you have as an independent, in fact, not just an independent bottler, but for any whiskey distillery. You know, there's so many casks in a warehouse, and nobody checks them on a daily basis. So occasionally you get a leaker, and it's just tough luck, really. That's kind of how it goes. So yeah, this liquid virgin oak finish kind of came in as a last minute substitute for the liquid Marsala finish. And the funny thing with the Marsala finish is I didn't really know what to do with it after that, because we had this cask that only had about 50, 60 litres of liquid in it. So it was transferred to stop the leaking. We quickly moved it into a first fill bourbon barrel as a temporary measure, and it was in there for about 3 or 4 weeks, and it was since transferred into a Koval rye quarter cask. So now we have this very interesting whiskey, which is not the one I'm talking about just now, but I do have this other whiskey, this other liquid that started off life in a hogshead, spent a year in a Marsala wine barrel, spent 4 weeks in a first fill bourbon refill barrel, and is now resting in a Koval rye cask. So by the time we get to bottle that one, that's going to be a very interesting whiskey that's kind of been round the houses a certain extent. What do we think of this one, guys?
It's nice, but it's they're kind of, it's easy. It's the first one, right? So it's not objectionable in any way, but not wow in any way either.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
This is like a nice vanilla ice cream, right? Nobody ever complains about vanilla ice cream, but it's vanilla.
Exactly. No, I understand what you're saying, and that's kind of why we kicked off with that liquid. Listen, guys, before I come on to whiskey number 2, just to give you a little bit of the background as to why, how, and where the company was set up. So my kind of story with whiskey goes back to 1997. Some of you probably know that my father is a guy called Billy Walker. He's done a couple of things in the whiskey industry. He's currently looking after Glenallachie Distillery, but back in 1997, I think it was, I had just left university, and I really had no, apart from the fact that my dad, I knew about whiskey because my dad had been working in the whiskey industry for as long as I could remember. But I didn't really have any particular ambition to start working in the whiskey industry. But I was trying to decide what I was going to do with my life, and my dad said, "Look, at the time my dad was working for Burns Stewart. The Burns Stewart may not be familiar to everybody, but they were the company that had Tobermory, Deanston, and later on the Bunnahabhain distilleries. So my dad had said to me, "Look, why don't you come and work at Burns Stewart for just a year? You can get some experience on your CV, and then you can go away and do whatever you want to do." So I did that, but I ended up staying for about 6.5 years. The whiskey industry is very addictive, and it's a little bit like being in the mafia. You know, once you're in, you can't get out. No matter how hard you try, they suck you back in. But I absolutely loved my time at Burns Stewart, but it was very different to to what I did after that, because it was a period when single malt, you know, from 1997 to 2003, single malts were still a relatively obscure part of the whiskey industry. You know, we were very much all about blended Scotch whiskey and liqueurs and vodkas and rums, and we were selling our whiskies to supermarkets, and we had these two distilleries, Tobermory and Deanston, and we thought, well, that's quite nice to have, you know, a couple of single malts in your portfolio, but we did very, very little with them, and you know, pretty much most of the liquid that we were making was being used to make blended Scotch. And I should add, funnily enough, it was during my time at Burn Stewart, I actually did manage to get out to Israel. So that probably was back around about 1998 or 99. I managed to get out to Israel because we had a whiskey called Scottish Leader, which was a blended Scotch whiskey, and we had appointed a company called Carmel Winery, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. So they were our distributor in Israel, and myself and my father, we came out to Tel Aviv to kind of meet with them and sort of start the business relationship. So very, very fond memories of my time in Israel. Tel Aviv is definitely one of the coolest places that I've ever been. I was very, very impressed with it. I have to say, I mean, I'm not sure what you guys think of it, but I thought the wines from Carmel were pretty decent. But I'm not even sure. You know, that was 20 years ago. So I don't even know if that company still works with Scotch whisky or anything like that. But so, like I say, I started off at Burn Stewart. I was there for 6.5 years. In 2003, Burn Stewart was sold to a company called Angostura, which are the guys that make the rums out in Trinidad and Tobago. I left the company. My father left the company. My dad was kind of scratching around trying to find out what to do next, and the next thing I know, he's gone and bought a distillery from Pernod Ricard, and that was Benriach. That was 2004, and I joined in on that project, and that was a very interesting time because we bought Benriach in 2004. It had been shut down by Pernod Ricard for a couple of years, and it actually closed about 4 of their distilleries at that time. And my father had approached them and said, look, are any of these for sale? And Carmel is the biggest winery in Israel. Yeah, I didn't know that. I thought the wines were good. Yes, decent wines, but there are better. I'll have to try them. So Benriach popped up, and that was a very fortunate acquisition, if you like, in terms of timing, because I think we paid about £6 million to buy Benriach, and if you try to buy a distillery today in Scotland that has been in production for decades and has got a good inventory of stock, you're going to pay a really big number. So we were very lucky to get that in 2004. And to me, it was just maybe 1 or 2 years before single malt started to go like this in terms of popularity. And we got to experience that whole journey. I mean, I was there for 12 years, from 2004 to 2016. We started with Benriach. In 2008, we bought Glendronach, which I'm sure you all know Glendronach, an absolutely amazing whiskey, fantastic distillery, one of the most highly regarded whiskies when it comes to sherry cask maturation. Unbelievable. I mean, that single maneuver elevated us from here to here. In 2013, we bought Glenglassaugh Distillery, and and it was brilliant. You know, we were involved in the industry at such an interesting time when you had a lot of really solid independent distilleries like Glenfarclas and Arran, Edredour, Bruichladdich, Springbank, and we were all kind of doing similar things. We were all kind of pioneering and taking these little whiskies that nobody had heard of and kind of taking them out to the world and doing all sorts of things with different casks and whiskey festivals and all this type of stuff. And it was brilliant. But like all good things, it did come to an end eventually. 2016, 2015, we were contacted by Brown Forman, the company that owns Jack Daniels. They were looking to get involved in Scotch whisky. Can we have a conversation? We're like, yeah, look, our distilleries they're not for sale, but you're welcome to come and have a look and have a chat. And a little bit like coming back to my earlier mafia comparison, they kind of made us an offer that we couldn't refuse. They put so much money on the table that it would have been crazy to say no. And my dad knew that he didn't want to leave the whiskey industry, but he also knew that he could take some of that money and go and buy another distillery and start a new project. So he did that with Glenallachie. I decided to go down a different path. I could have gone and worked at Glenallachie, and that might happen one day because it is a family business. But I wanted to have a crack at doing my own thing. I'd never been my own boss, and I did want to stay within the whiskey industry. And I had a look at what the options were, and I quite fancied independent bottling. You know, there are good and bad parts to independent bottling, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. But I had a conversation with my dad. He said, "Look, what do you want to do? Are you coming to Glenallachie?" And I said, "Look, don't take this the wrong way. We've worked together for like 20 years, 21 years, and it's been great. But I'd quite like to go and try something else." And we do still have some cooperation because I store probably 80% of my casks up at Glenallachie. Any of my re-racking I do up at Glenallachie because they've got the ability to do that. And Billy's been, my dad's named Billy. He's been really helpful in terms of, you know, occasionally they might come across some very interesting types of wood, things like, you know, virgin oak from Spain or France or Russia that we're looking at, some chinkapin oak, some really, really nice Italian red wine casks that are made with French oak. So quite often he'll give me a shout and say, "Look, we're bringing in some of these casks, but if you want to take 5 or 6 of them and use them for some re-racks, why don't you do that?" So we have some nice cooperation in that regard. So there's still some good interaction. And like I say, my dad always says to me, you can't run away from Glenallachie forever. But at the moment, I'm running quite hard. But I'm enjoying doing this. It's completely different to what I did before. It's a different side of the industry. And like I say, I'll come on and talk about some of the pros and the cons of independent bottling. But let's crack on to whiskey number 2. So this is the Glentalkers. Very nice colour on this one. It's a little bit like Ribena, and it tastes a little bit like Ribena. This is a very, very fruity whiskey. So it's 11-year-old Glentalkers, and it's been finished in a ruby port hogshead, again for about 1 year. Beautiful colour. I absolutely love, I really, really love this one. It's one of the one of the big flavors you'll get on this. A lot of apricots coming through, and a lot of stone fruits. You know, things like peaches, plums. There's a lot of nice berries in there as well, or some red grapes and some nice rich cranberries as well. It's very, very fruity, bursting with fruit flavour. A little bit of toffee in there too, a little touch of dark chocolate, but definitely one of the fruitiest whiskies that we brought out to date. And that's what you should get from a ruby port cask. If it was a tawny port, it might be a little bit nuttier and a little bit drier, but because it's a ruby port, it tends to be more towards that really, really sweet, fruity, energetic kind of style.
So Alistair, one question regardless of the whiskey. Can you tell us why you chose to name the company or the whiskey line Infrequent Flyers?
It's a good question. It's not a typical whiskey name, and I must have, when I had decided I wanted to do this, the most difficult thing was trying to come up with a name. And every time a name would pop into my head, I would write it down on a sheet of paper, and I ended up with a list of about 100 names. And the problem was that at any time you found what you thought was a good name that had a whiskey connotation, it was already registered by another whiskey company, because you know there's so many whiskey companies out there that have been there for a long time, and they'll just register any of the good names that come up. So I decided I was going to have to go for something that was a little bit non-traditional. Infrequent Flyers was something, I think it's something I used to chat about with some of my colleagues from other whiskey companies. We used to travel a lot. Unfortunately, nobody is traveling a lot just now. We're all infrequent flyers, guys. We're all infrequent flyers. It wasn't
frequent bus. We don't even take the bus anymore. Come on.
Hey, listen. If you're allowed to leave your own zip code, you're lucky. You know. So the name.
We got pictures from our friends in Glasgow that they have foxes roaming the streets in Glasgow.
Wow, that just shows how far things have gone. It's a shame I've not been in Glasgow. I mean, I used to go to Glasgow almost every week, and I've not been able to go to Glasgow for about 6 months.
Then take a rabies shot before you go.
It makes a change from COVID. but to come back to the name, we used to travel a lot, and I used to talk to some of my friends at Springbank and Arran and Duncan Taylor and all these companies, and we all used to complain about traveling. And I always said my ambition one day was to become an infrequent flyer, and that's just kind of the name sort of stuck. And I thought I can use this because it equates to the type. A lot of the distilleries that we might buy our whiskey from might not be the most famous distilleries. You know, Linkwood and Glen Spey. Where else have we got? You know, even Glentalkers. You know, these are not these are not Ardbegs or Lefroy's or Macallans or Glenlivets or Glenfiddich. These are lesser known distilleries, and I thought I could tie in the whole infrequent flyers concept to these lesser travelled casks, and that's kind of the story behind the name. I don't know if it's a good name or a bad name, but I had to come up with a name, and I kind of thought let's go with that. Let's go with that name. You know, the best name for any independent bottler is Provenance. Douglas Lang nailed that one decades ago, but Provenance is one word that says everything about single cask bottling. It's perfect. It's absolutely the perfect name, and I would have loved that name. I can't have that name, so we have Infrequent Flyers instead.
I have a question about, is the number 2 is Glen Torches, 11 years old?
Yes.
If I understood right, which area is it distilled?
Glentorkers is Speyside. It's up in Speyside. So it's quite, it's kind of right in the heart of Speyside. It's just outside a little place called Mulben, and Mulben is quite close to Keith. And Mulben is actually where the Chivas brothers have their massive warehouse complex. So Mulben's quite famous for whiskey, and you've got 5 or 6 distilleries in the local area. You've got Thrusk, and you've got Strathila's quite close by. So Glentorkers is right in the heart of Speyside. And I've got to be honest, this is actually the first cask of Glentorkers that we have bottled so far. And for some reason, ever since I started this company, I wanted to bottle a cask of Glentorkers. I'm not entirely sure why, but I had tried some nice Glentorkers whiskies in the past, and I really wanted to get my hands on some. And I did manage to get some quite early, but they weren't ready. I needed to do something with them. I needed to give them a little bit more time. So this is the first Glentorkers that we've released, but it definitely won't be the last. And again, it's another one of those whiskies that is mainly used for blending. I mean, it comes from quite an old distillery. Glentorkers dates back to actually 1898, which is the same year that Ben Riach was built. There's quite a lot of distilleries built at the end of the 19th century, which actually was a bit of a mistake, because around about 1900, we had an incident in the industry called the Pattison crash, which resulted in quite a large number of distilleries being mothballed, and in some cases, some of them never ever saw the light of day. But Glentorkers has had quite an interesting history. It's been owned by the 2 biggest companies in whiskey at different times. It was with Diageo at one point, before it was sold to Allied Distillers, which became part of Chivas. So it's had changes of ownership. But yeah, nice, really nice whiskey. Loving what this port cask was doing with it. What do you think of this one, folks?
I don't usually like port, but I like this one a lot. It has that Glentorkers identity, like minerality and chalky. It's great.
That's good. I mean, it is always one of the dangers when you do a lot of wood finishing, is you might lose the personality of the distillery, and it's quite an important subject, because with our bottlings, we try and strike a balance between distillery character and wood influence. So if you take any typical batch of Infrequent Flyers, say there's 6 casks, you'll typically find that 2 or 3 of them are the original cask that we haven't done anything to, and the other half of the bottlings might be things that we've put into a sherry cask or a port cask or a virgin oak, etc. And I think it's important to do both of those, because I personally like re-racking. I like wood finishes. I love the different flavors that different types of cask can bring to a whiskey, and it's one area where an independent bottler actually gets to put their influence on a whiskey. You've got to remember that we're all frustrated distillers at heart, and as an independent bottler, you're ultimately dealing with whiskey that other people have made. So you want to get involved in the process, and you want to try and put your spin on it, and that's where that enthusiasm for re-racking and wood finishing comes in. And I've got to say that is the most fun part of the job, is getting a whiskey, putting it in a different type of cask, and then just leaving it for 6 months or a year, 18 months, 2 years, and then coming back to it and seeing how that whiskey has actually changed. That you get no bigger thrill when those samples come in, and you get to see the outcome of these wood finish experiments. But it's important at the same time to keep some of those whiskies back in their original cask, so that you've got casks that you can bottle that are going to capture the distillery character without any interference from wood other than like a bourbon barrel or a refill hogshead. So we try and strike that kind of balance between those two different types of cask, if you like. Okay. So guys, let's move on to whiskey number 3. Now, this is it's a 27-year-old. This was bottled back in October 2019, and you will notice that we are being a little bit cagey, sketchy, mysterious, secretive about the source of the whiskey. So it's from an undisclosed Speyside distillery. Now, I wish I could give you some more information about the distillery, but I genuinely do not know which distillery this whiskey came from. Sometimes when you buy a cask, you are told which distillery it comes from, but you're not allowed to use the name. The final whiskey of tonight's tasting, which is the Islay, is one of those. I know exactly where it came from, and I'm going to ask you all to guess once we taste it. Sometimes you buy a whiskey, you don't know where it came from, but you can tell pretty much where it came from. And we do have an undisclosed Orkney tonight, and you've got a 50-50 chance of getting that one right. Undisclosed Speyside is a little bit more difficult. There's a lot of distilleries in Speyside. The one clue that I had is that I actually bought this whiskey from a broker, from a third party, so I did not buy it direct from the producer. But the casks were sitting in one of the Chivas warehouses. So I'm pretty confident that this is from a Chivas distillery from Speyside that would have been operational in 1992. The problem is that as a company, Chivas have always had a very big bias towards the Speyside region. They've got a lot of distilleries from that area. And when I actually looked at the numbers, there's probably about 15 different distilleries that this could be. It could be Glenfiddich, it could be Longmore, it could be Benriach, it could be Capardonic, it could be Altmore, it could be Milton Duff, it could be Glentalkers. The list goes on and on and on. So very, very difficult to focus in on it. However, we managed to get, there was 4 casks that we bought as part of this parcel. So typically, when we're buying casks, we usually try and buy a parcel of casks. So you'll buy 5 or 6 sister casks from the same run, cask numbers, cask type, vintage, etc. And we got 4 of these, and I absolutely loved them. We bottled 2 of them so far. This one in the original cask. I see some nice tasting notes there. Citrus, lemongrass. For me, this one is all about those kind of tropical fruit notes. It's very soft. It's very delicate. It's very kind of perfumey. It's got that sort of pineapple, that watermelon characteristic. Very, very floral.
On the palate, but I think after the port, so everyone should rinse the palate with some water, because this one is really gentle and a lower ABV. So
yeah, absolutely, Gal, absolutely. This one reminded me. So when I was kind of reluctant to buy undisclosed Speyside casks, because they are more difficult to promote. It's easy to sell an undisclosed Islay and an undisclosed Orkney, because people will buy Islay whiskey irrespective of what it is. And we'll talk about the Orkney but I think when you taste the Orkney and you kind of probably know where it comes from, you'll understand that it's going to be popular. But when you come to a Speyside, it's so difficult to pinpoint which distillery it might be. So I was kind of reluctant, but when I tried the samples, I thought this is one of the these are some of the nicest casks I've come across. In terms of style, it reminded me of some of the Benriach casks we had from the 1970s. Now, they're nowhere near as old as that, but they had that really soft, delicate tropical fruit characteristic that was very typical of your kind of 1975, 1976 Benriachs. And even to this day, I would say that this is one of the nicest casks that we've managed to get our hands on. But it's almost fragile. It's so soft and so delicate. But I love it. I absolutely love this style of whiskey. And of course, it's 27 years old, so it's got a lot more maturity than the first two whiskies that we tried tonight.
So I think when I tasted this, I think it was one of the first that I tasted from the range, because I tasted it out of order, and I wanted to have the light ones at the beginning. So I really liked it from the first sip. The nose is very light, but the palate is just gorgeous with all the exotics that's going on. It's very classic stuff.
Yeah, I have to agree, Gal. It's really like this one. Yeah, I wish there was more like it. I wish there was more like it out there. And you don't come across these things every day. Very nice whiskey. And just that, if I had to pinpoint what to me a Speyside malt whiskey tastes like, that to me is a great example of a mature Speyside malt whiskey. And one not from the heavier, kind of beefier end of the spectrum, one of those more fruitier, floral styles of whiskey that's probably had a lot of copper contact when it was going through the distillation process. Maybe had a long fermentation and a long distillation, and gone through shell and tube condensers. Beautiful. That would be my guess based on the taste profile of this whiskey. But yeah, lovely stuff. Very easy to drink. And like I say, I wish I could tell you exactly where it came from. But in this one, it's a bit of a guessing game. It could be Benriach. Who knows? Okay, guys, before we come on to the next whiskey, I did want to touch. Yes.
What cask is it?
It's a refill bourbon barrel.
A barrel. Okay,
Yeah.
great.
So a little bit. I suppose the advantage there with barrels compared to hogsheads, compared to puncheons or butts, the smaller the cask, the more contact between the liquid and the wood. So that's where a barrel does have a good advantage. But I wanted to come up, touch on the last sort of 2.5 years since I started this project. Was certainly a bit of a learning journey for me. I've always worked for a distillery, and it's kind of like you're jumping over the fence, gamekeeper turned poacher. When you go from distiller to independent bottler, suddenly you're not the person that makes the whiskey. You're the person that's out there trying to buy the whiskey. And there's definitely there's some advantages to independent bottling, and there's some disadvantages. I would say that what drew me to it was the fact that you didn't have to spend millions of pounds to buy a distillery. You didn't have to build a distillery from scratch and then wait 8 years, 10 years before you had any whiskey that you could actually sell to people. And also it meant that you theoretically you could work with every distillery in Scotland and beyond. So suddenly you've got all this variety at your fingertips. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, because getting access to stock these days is not as straightforward as it was maybe 10, 15 years ago. When I look at the kind of landscape of independent bottling, to me, there's 5 really big traditional companies that dominate: Gordon and MacPhail, Signatory, Cadenheads, Douglas Lang, Hunter Lang. To me, those are the big 5. Then you've got other guys that have been about for a long time, like Hart Brothers, Adelphi, Duncan Taylor, Murray McDavid, some of the great Italian bottlers like Samaroli, Wilson and Morgan. And there's loads. Germany, there's a ridiculous amount of independent bottlers in Germany, Zanzibar, Whiskey Agency. But when I look at the guys that have been doing this for a long time, they do have the advantage that they've been buying casks for decades. And if you go back 10, 20, 30 years, there was a period where single malt really wasn't that popular. You go back to the 1980s, single malt was, it was dying. Distilleries were closing all over the place. There was no interest in the product. But back then, and in the 90s, there were some very clever people that were buying casks from distilleries like Macallan and Mortlach and Laphroaig and Ardbeg and Springbank and all these places. Whiskies that would cost an absolute fortune for me to buy today. I was talking to the guy who's the managing director of Tomatin, who's a friend of mine, a couple of weeks ago, and he said, he was laughing. He said, he'd been looking through some of the old records at Tomatin. Because typically, a lot of these distilleries for years and years and years have had filling contracts with other distilleries. And he said he was looking back at some stuff from the late 80s, early 90s. And he said, you want to have seen the amount of Macallan that Tomatin filled. And hundreds and hundreds of casks of Macallan. And I said, it's amazing. What happened to it? He said, it would have gone into a blend somewhere as a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old. And, hindsight is a wonderful thing. So your Gordon MacPhails and your Signatories have this tremendous advantage because they've got decades worth of stock of amazing distilleries that they probably didn't pay very much money to get a hold of. The challenge you have now, if you come in 2018, like I did, as a new independent bottler, on day one, you don't have a single cask. You have zero stock. So you've got to go out and build your inventory. And at the moment, first of all, a lot of distilleries won't sell directly to independent bottlers. You might have to go through a broker, and then you're going to pay a little bit more. So that we do a little bit. We do a combination of both. We buy directly from some distillers, and we go through third-party brokers for other stock. But I have to say that even in the last 2 years, I just keep seeing prices going like this. And the market's crazy at the moment. There's probably too many independent bottlers, and I'm guilty. But there's also there's a weird kind of situation where you have consumers buying casks, especially, you might find a wealthy consumer comes along and buys a cask of 40-year-old Macallan in an auction, and he pays £500,000 for this cask of Macallan, and suddenly everybody puts their prices up because there's this perception that single malt has to be worth more than it actually is. So it's tricky at the moment. There's certain whiskies it's very difficult to get. And that's one of the reasons that when I started out with this, I thought, you know what? One way to go is to try and buy Ardbeg, Laphroaig, Macallan, Springbank, those big names. Or you go to places like Milton Duff, Altmore, Craigellachie, Benriach, and you buy what are very good whiskies, just not as well known as some of these other names. And you do things with those. You put them in sherry casks, and you put them in port casks, and you put them in Madeira casks, and you change the direction of the whiskey. And suddenly, over time, you end up with a very nice portfolio, lots of different distilleries, and lots of different cask styles. And you make your reputation based on that process. Now, don't get me wrong. If I can buy, you know, like a Bowmore, for example, we picked up some Bowmore casks. We picked up some Ben Nevis casks. Ben Nevis is quite a good name. There's a few relatively well-known casks that we've managed to buy, but I'm not obsessed with that. I think there's a lot of good whiskey out there from lesser-known distilleries, and that's kind of where we are focusing our attention at the moment. And I think there's a huge amount to be said for good cask wood management, and that's where you can really bring quality doing your bottlings. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at the moment. Probably time for whiskey number 4. Yes,
Alistair.
Yes.
Speaking of inventory, so currently, do you have also, I guess you're buying some casks and bottling it immediately. Are you also buying casks to be aged and for future years?
I would say that 98% of what we buy, we don't bottle immediately. It's great when you buy casks and they're ready to go immediately. But sometimes because of if you buy them quite young, you might want to leave them a little bit longer. If you're planning to do re-racking, that takes a lot of time. I mean, a re-rack program, to explain about that in a little bit more detail, I mentioned before that I do a lot of my re-racking up at Glenallachie, and a typical re-rack program might consist of 60 casks that you want to transfer into different types of wood. So I'll send up a plan to Glenallachie saying, look, these are the whiskies I want to re-rack. I want this one to go into a sherry cask, this one a port cask, etc. But they're also very busy doing their own fillings and their own re-rackings. So typically it can take me about 3 or 4 months to get a re-rack program complete. And once you've done that, you've got to give those whiskies a reasonable amount of time to get the benefit from those casks. So that immediately means that those casks are going to be sitting in your ownership for maybe a year, 18 months, 2 years longer before you come to bottle them. The other thing that I've started looking at this year is trying to buy new make, trying to buy fillings. Now I hadn't really considered that before because it's such a long time scale from new make to say 10 years when you might decide to bottle it. But looking at the longer term, it does make sense to try and get some fillings if you can. They're a lot cheaper than buying mature stock. It's a good investment. And what's quite interesting is there's been a lot of new distilleries that have started up in Scotland in the last 4 or 5 years. And some of those distilleries might be open to the idea of doing fillings because, let's face it, they need the money. And it's going to be a long time before they've got any actual whiskey to sell. So that's something I'm looking at. But yeah, typically we'll buy stuff and we'll sit on it for a while. Sometimes it just needs a little bit longer. Sometimes it's a re-rack. Sometimes you want to wait for it to get to a certain age. Occasionally, you'll get something. A great example was our second bottling was a 26-year-old Auchentoshan. And I remember when I was sent a sample of the cask, and the guys had re-gauged it, and they said, look, it's like 42.6%. And I'm like, guys, that's a really, even for a 26-year-old, that's a really low alcohol strength. It's kind of unusual. And the problem is, if it drops below 40%, it's not whiskey. And I tried the sample, and I liked the whiskey. I was nervous about the strength. I said, look, guys, I'm going to buy the cask, but you need to move it immediately, because I'm going to bottle it almost straight away, because I can't keep it for any length of time in case the strength goes even lower. So sometimes you might have a situation like that where you have to bottle it. Other times you might just say, do you know what? There was a Linkwood 9-year-old that we bottled, I think, on our second batch, that had been in a really interesting cask. It was a decharred, recharred cask, but possibly ex-red wine provenance, and it was incredible. And to be honest, it had been in the cask long enough. It had been in that cask for 9 years. It had taken so much from the wood. It was absolutely ready to be bottled. And even at 9 years is probably the youngest one that we've actually bottled to date. But I didn't want to leave that one any longer. So that one was actually bottled quite soon after we bought it. Yeah.
Alistair, may I ask you a question?
Yes.
In what frequency do you taste casks that you have re-racked?
To be honest, it's probably about once a year at the most frequent. There's so many casks that we're sitting on, and sometimes you have to just let some of them kind of fall out of your attention span and do their thing. In an ideal world, we would do it more frequently. But the fact is, we're only ever going to bottle about 40 or 50 casks a year. So it doesn't make sense to sample them overly frequently. So yeah, typically maybe once a year. There's certain casks that, like, at the moment, I have an idea of probably 70% of the casks that I want to bottle this year. So those are the ones that I'm going to be keeping an eye on. There's other casks that I know I'm going to leave till next year or the year after. So I'm not going to touch them at the moment. But then there's other casks that you've done something with that you might not be planning to bottle anytime soon, but you're very curious to know what's going on with the wood influence, and you might pop in and get some samples of those. Getting samples as an independent bottler is not as easy as it is when you're a distiller. When you're a distiller, you've got your guys that work for you, and you can say any day of the week, go and draw samples from that cask. When you're one step removed and you're doing it as a third party, it's much more difficult to get access to samples. So you lose
a month of two.
at least.
Yeah,
I've got
sure.
This industry, honestly, the whiskey industry is one of the most inefficient industries in the world. See, when you think about the amount of money that this industry generates, and then you actually look at how slow everything is, trying to get samples.
It's the essence of whiskey, no?
I know, it is. Whiskey is a slow process, but things like samples and moving casks and bottling, that should all be quicker. But it's not. It really is a very traditional. I mean, I'll give you another example. When you buy a cask, the person that owns the cask sends you a piece of paper called a delivery order, and all you have to do is sign that and post it to the warehouse that the cask is located in, and then that cask will become your cask. However, nobody wants to do this by email. This all has to be done by physical post, which to me is absolutely crazy in this day and age. But it's like nobody will accept an email of a delivery order. They want to see a piece of paper with your actual ink signature on it. It's things like that I think are.
It's charming. Think about it as like it's charming.
Charming is a very kind word to use for it. I think you're being very generous. Anyway, it's a slow industry, and there's things like samples can be more problematic than you might imagine. Yeah. Anyway, whiskey number 4. So this is 21-year-old from a secret Orkney distillery, distilled in 1999. You can see a nice mahogany colour on that one. So this one was finished in a Pedro Jimenez sherry puncheon for about 12 months. Orkney, anytime you see Orkney on a whiskey label, there's a really good chance that it's from Highland Park. You've got a 50-50 chance anyway that it's Highland Park or Scapa. But Highland Park is much more readily available under the Orkney label than Scapa. Sometimes you can tell by the distillation year. There's periods when Scapa was closed. I'm not even sure if Scapa was operational in 1999. But I'm 98.7% certain that this whiskey comes from Highland Park. And one of the clues actually comes in the flavour profile. One of the unique aspects of the distillation at Highland Park is the fact that 20% of the mash bill is peaty, and they always use local Orcadian barley. And Orcadian barley has got its own character that's unique to the island of Orkney. There's a lot of sort of heather and moss that is going into that peat, if you like. So you get a style of peat that's different to Islay. It's different to mainland Scotland peat. It's grassier, it's earthier. It gives you a softer, kind of sweeter, more aromatic, herbal kind of profile. So, and you will pick up a little touch of peat on this. There's a lot going on. One of the great things I've always thought of Highland Park. Highland Park's one of those whiskies that has a lot of different things happening. It's very complex. It's not one-dimensional. So you've got all the flavors you would get from Highland Park. You've got that peat in there, that little soft touch of peat. I mean, I would never describe this as a peated whiskey because there's not enough there to say this is a peated whiskey. But that little touch of smoke is there, and then you expose all of that to a big Pedro Jimenez sherry puncheon. I mean, of all the casks that are out there, PX is the one that absolutely delivers over the top. The chocolate, the raisins, the sultanas, the kind of Christmas cake, the sort of stewed fruits, the plums, the Demerara sugars, the Morello cherries. It's all of that stuff that you get from PX casks mixed in here with that little smoky characteristic.
So, Alistair, I believe we have a question from Lahav. So, would you like to ask a question, Lahav? We hear you, not that.
Maybe I would say really, but my question is like that. You're keeping track of finishing.
We cannot hear you. Your voice is not clear.
It's very fuzzy, very fuzzy. If you want to type.
Maybe you can type the question. I will ask Alistair instead.
Yeah, I think there's about 2 more questions there on the chat. You can check it out. 1 second.
So what have we got? Do you do your own vatting, or is everything bottled as single casks? Vatting. I mean, everything that we release, we do as single casks. We haven't gotten into blending malts. I don't know if that's what the question is asking. I know a lot I think maybe what you're touching on there is, I know a lot of my contemporaries will maybe take 5 or 6 casks of the same whiskey, vat them together and put them out as a batch release and maybe reduce the alcohol strength to 50% or 46%.
Yeah, that's really nice.
That I haven't done that. My kind of take on it is that the ultimate version of a whiskey is a single cask bottled at cask strength, and I'm trying to focus on that. I do totally understand why people like to do the vattings, because the biggest problem that we have is that single casks do not give you a lot of bottles, and you never have enough to keep everybody happy. Even when you do like I mean, if you look at this Orkney, this is one of the biggest casks. A puncheon is one of the biggest casks that we would use. So you're getting almost 700 bottles from this, but it's more typical that you're going to get between sort of 200 and 300 bottles from a barrel or a hogshead. And, you know, we're selling into 9 different countries. So suddenly you're diluting the allocation to all of these people. If you do a vatting, you can take as many casks as you like, as long as they all come from the same distillery. You can put them together, you can drop the strength down to 46%, and then suddenly you have got thousands of bottles that you can keep everybody happy. But to me, those don't have the same appeal as a single cask. So my focus at the moment is on single cask. And to be honest, I don't think that will change, because the way we've set up the re-rack program would make it really difficult to do that now, because we have got a lot of whiskies from the same distilleries at the same age, but they're now all sitting in different types of wood. And it would be crazy then to put all of those back together and do a vatting. So my kind of focus is on single casks, but I do understand the benefits of doing the vattings.
No, but there's an argument, Alistair, on a small batch that without diluting it and keeping it at cask strength, that if you have 3 or 4 sister casks and you marry them together, that maybe if you have one poorer cask, you can still keep the quality very, very high without compromising on quality.
No, that's very true. It's very true. I just feel you're kind of moving into blended malt territory a little bit. I know it's still a single malt because they're all the same distillery, but to me, you're then starting to look at the blenders kind of art, if you like. Whereas for me, single casks are all about getting that unique characteristic from one individual vessel. And even like you say, you know, you can have 4 or 5 sister casks, and some of them may be similar, but you might have 1 or 2 that are completely different. Sometimes in a better way, and sometimes in a worse way. And to me, what you should do is go in and pick the ones that you think are the most outstanding, and put them out as a single cask. And then if there's one that you think has fallen under the average, then you might have to do something with it in terms of a different type of wood. But listen, there's no right or wrong answer. There's merit, there's absolute merit to vattings, and it does bring in the blenders art. But it's not the kind of way I want to go. I'm really I'm trying to keep things as simple as possible, to be honest. And single casks they're complicated, but they're also very simple. And it is the most natural version of the whiskey you can get your hands on. But it's a good question, very good question.
And that was the right answer for me too.
Listen, it's something I did think about at the start. You know, one of the decisions that I had to make was, even though you're bottling single casks, what about reducing everything to 46%? And then at least you know that every bottle is going to be that strength, and you're going to get more. And I did consider that, but the more I spoke to people, they were saying, look, that is not what you're going to get from the market. The market's going to come back and tell you they want that to be at cask strength. And that was kind of the feedback. And I thought, you know, you should always listen to your customers. They are the most important people. If you can give your customers what they want, you're going to do okay.
If you have a perfect product, you don't put brakes or extra wheels or any gadgets on it. You just let it speak.
Exactly. And the great thing with cask strength is that you can, it's then up to the drinker to decide if they want to drink at cask strength or if they want to put a little bit of water in. But then you have a choice. If we were to reduce the strength, then we take that choice away. So yeah, the focus is on single cask strength all the way forward. Don't get that. There are things I would like to do in terms of, you know, buying whiskies that don't come from Scotland. I'd like to broaden it out to some different countries in terms of where we source our product from. I like the idea of doing a blended malt and of a particular style, but these are things that are for another next year or the year after or the year after. We'll see what happens. Anyway, guys, what do you think of this Orkney 21-year-old sherry finish?
Bacon and maple.
Bacon and maple is very, very. I like that tasting note. I think that's something that comes up quite a lot with peated whiskies that have been in a sherry cask. Is that sweet and sour, savoury, and then that kind of very sweet, not fruity, but more chocolatey, sugary sort of character that comes through.
Like meat and tobacco, you know, a bit of tobacco as well.
There's something I get on this, on the taste at the very back, and it reminds me of smoked salmon. When you have a piece of Scottish salmon that has been in a smoker for a long time, and it's very pungent and aromatic, I get that at the back of this. I've never identified that in a whiskey before, and for this one, it's like, you know when you taste a whiskey and you can't quite put your finger on something, and then it suddenly pops into your head. That's what I got with this one, with that very smoky smoked fish, smoked salmon coming through there. Not on the nose, on the palate. But there's amazing things you can do with sherry casks, and they do tend to be very popular these days. I personally, I'm a big fan of sherry cask whiskies. I think when you've worked at Glendronach for 8 years, it's impossible not to be. The Glendronach 18-year-old, the Allardyce, is still my kind of go-to whiskey today. I made sure that when I left the company, I took quite a big supply of that whiskey with me. But there seems to be a trend these days that people are really into sherry cask whiskies, which is great, but there are other styles of wood out there that are fantastic. If you can get access to anything that's been in a good Sauterne cask, good port cask, you know, these are some really nice styles of whiskey as well. Okay, so guys, let's move on to the final one, which is we've obviously left the rather peaty one to the end. Now we're going to have a little game. This is officially an undisclosed Islay whiskey, 14 years old, from a refill hogshead, and it's 57.7%. I want you to have a look at this whiskey, nose it, taste it, and have a think about where you think it comes from. And what I'll do is I'll shout out some names of Islay distilleries, and you can put your hand up if you think that is the source of this whiskey.
1 in 8, so you got a nice chance.
It smells good though, if I may say.
I do. If you're not adverse to adding water to your whiskey, I always find these heavily peated whiskies really open up with a few drops of water. But it's entirely your choice.
Did you give a hint earlier in your presentation as to which distillery this may come from?
I don't think so. No. I'm trying to remember.
So we can subtract a few of them.
Definitely from one of the 3 southern ones, and I can't decide yet if it's Laphroaig or Ardbeg.
So we've had some suggestions for Laphroaig and Ardbeg.
They're pretty different, but it tastes like somewhere in between, and it's like too soft for one and too hard for the other.
Is it Buna Habain?
It does not taste like Kaolila. To my
So we've got someone saying maybe Buna Habain, someone saying not Kalila, someone saying maybe Ardbeg, maybe Laphroaig. What about
Bowmore?
There's Bowmore, Lagavulin, there's
Kilchoman
Coleman
and Bruichladi.
Bruichladi, yes, those are the options. It's definitely not Ardnaho. It's it's too old for that.
I'm going to go for Lagavulin, just to round it
It's
up.
very grassy. It's a very grassy whiskey. I haven't tasted it yet, but the nose is very grassy.
I say it's a Lagavulin.
Well, we were thinking about this. The question has come up.
Wow.
The cask for finish is like Indiana Jones. You need to find which cask is better. Indiana Jones? You need to find which cask is the best. There's a lot of houses, a lot of casks. What is your way of choosing the cask for finishing? I've got to be honest. When it comes to finishing, we are very experimental. We will happily try to put whiskies in every type of cask that's out there, and we'll see what happens. Typically, it depends what. Not everything's available always at the one time. If I've got an idea of some parcels that I want to re-rack, I know which parcels they are. Then I need to see what casks I can get my hands on within a 6-month period. Usually, we can get sherry casks pretty easily, but sometimes things like Madeira and Sauterne, Moscatel, rum can be difficult to get. Rum casks are absolutely fantastic for maturing whiskey. Unfortunately, we have struggled to get access to some good rum casks up until just recently. We managed to get a few. We did a small re-rack program with some rum casks, but that's one I would definitely like to get some more of. Indiana Jones, a way to find unique things. Yes, now I get it. I like that. That's quite good. You have no idea. It's quite remarkable how often Indiana Jones comes up in a whiskey tasting for no particular reason. Anyway, to find a cask, no, I mean, traveling at the moment to find casks is quite difficult. We tend to, I work a lot with Glenallachie on cask sourcing in terms of refilling for casks, and also with Speyside cooperage. So at this point, we haven't gone directly to any suppliers of sherry or port. We're too small, to be honest, for it to make sense. These guys like to ship 100, 150 casks at a time, whereas we like to buy 5 or 6 empty casks at a time. So we need to kind of go through other people. But the good thing, working with Glenallachie, they've got some good inroads to some pretty cool casks, and we sometimes get a little benefit on the back of that as well. But coming back to this this Islay whiskey, let's do a quick run through. So let's go. Who wants to see Lagavulin? Pop your hand up for Lagavulin. Let's go a few Lagavulins. Kalila, any Kalila? Maybe 1, 2, maybe. Bruichladdich.
I'm going for Bruichladdich.
So anyone else for Bruichladdich? One Bruichladdich there. What about Buna? Any Bunnahabhain? Bunnahabhain? One Buna.
Even if they're not peated, I know they're not peated, but they have some, very few peated. Very few.
They do. They have a type of whiskey called Stoisha, Bunnahabhain Stoisha, which is the peated variant of Bunnahabhain. So you're right. They do have that. What about Ardbeg? Any Ardbeg? Couple, 4, maybe 5. Lafroig? Lafroig, maybe 2. Kilcoman? No, 1 Kilcoman. 1. Okay, well, guys, I can reveal that it does come from Kalila. So anyone that said Kalila, congratulations. I would say that Ardbeg and Lafroig are very expensive to buy for bottlers. Lagavulin is almost impossible to get. Diageo are very, very tight on Lagavulin. We have got some Bowmore and some Bunnahabhain in the inventory, but
this is not a usual Kalila.
I mean, I'm not sure what a usual Kalila is. I do like Kalila. I mean, I think there's a sweetness you get with Kalila, and it's not. I don't think it's overwhelmingly iodine or medicinal. Like take a Lafroig, for example. Lafroig is very medicinal, very iodine. Ardbeg is very heavily peated whiskey. I think, apart from Octomore, maybe the most peated of the Islay whiskies. But I like the balance you get with Kalila. One of the reasons that you tend to find quite a lot of Kalila available from independent bottlers is the sheer size of the distillery. It's the biggest distillery on Islay. It's over 5 million litres, so there's always a bit of excess capacity, which means that casks will make it onto the open market. Islay is becoming one of the most difficult regions to get casks from. It's incredibly popular. And the companies that own the distilleries on Islay are becoming more and more reluctant to actually make any of that stock available. Like I say, we have picked up some Bowmore and some Bunnahabhain, which we were very fortunate to get. We picked up some Kalila, but we weren't allowed to use the name. So I can tell you it's Kalila. I know for a fact it's Kalila, but I'm not allowed to put that on the label. So sometimes when you buy from a distillery, they're happy to sell you the whiskey, but they want to protect the brand name. So then you have to decide if you're willing to accept the cask without the provenance. When it comes to Islay, it's okay. It's not a problem because Islay is such a popular style category that it's not difficult to sell an undisclosed Islay. But it comes back to what I was saying before. An undisclosed Speyside is more difficult to sell than an undisclosed Islay. It's just the way the market is at the moment. The wet dog felt nice. I don't even know what that means.
You know, when we're talking peated whiskey, so one note is that comes to mind for me is the wet dog. You know, the medicinal kind of a wet.
The smell of a wet dog.
Yeah, the smell of the wet dog. Yeah.
Not the taste of a wet dog.
I've never tasted the dog yet. but
No,
the smell is really, you know, comes.
White Oak is actually a very stinky stuff after owning 2 dogs.
Yeah, but this is like stinky stuff. It's, you know, like.
This is actually a very, very lovely Kalila. One of the best Kalilas I think I had. The most interesting one, anyway.
I mean, as I say, I do like Kalila. I'm also a big fan of Bowmore. I like Bowmore as an Isla because there's always a nice sweetness you get with Bowmore. And I think Lagavulin is fantastic, but I don't really think there's a possibility to find a cask of Lagavulin. I honestly could show you some of the offers that I've received on things like Laphroaig, Ardbeg, Lagavulin, Glendronach, Springbank. Ridiculous numbers to buy casks. That doesn't make sense. So that there is there's like a weird upper level of madness that is running amok in the whiskey industry, and then underneath that you've got some common sense. Some people play up on this level, but you know, to me, when you buy a cask, there's no point in buying whiskey and keeping it in a cask forever. A whiskey will only fulfill its ambition in life when it ends up in a bottle. That has to be the final destination for a whiskey. And the problem is when people are selling casks for unbelievably high amounts of money, it actually limits the ability to then put that whiskey into a bottle at a price that people can afford to buy. And then once it is in a bottle, you want people to actually be able to open it and drink it instead of keeping it as a piece of art or an investment. Ultimately, I don't think we would ever get to a point where we had a whiskey that people wouldn't open. We're not kind of in that area. Our whiskies are really for drinking, and I hope that I kind of like the industry to go back to that. Whiskey's for drinking. It's not an investment. But it's funny. It's changed a lot. That's one of the big changes I've seen in 20 years. When I was working even at Benriach in 2004, you know, the oldest whiskey we had was from 1966. That was the oldest Benriach stock that there was. And we bottled a cask. We only had 6 casks and we bottled one of them. I don't know what age it was, 1966, 2004, 38 years old. And the retail price was £200. And at the time, that was the sensible price for a 38-year-old Benriach. Today, it'll be some crazy number. It's changed.
How has whiskey changed? Like, is there like fashion in whiskey, and whiskey from the 60s is somehow different than whiskeys made today?
I think you'll get 100 different answers in whoever you speak to on this. I think I heard a very good explanation from a guy I know who's a really big whiskey fan, and he loves whiskies from like the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And his kind of take on it was that back then, because single malts were not as popular, when they were bottled, the distilleries picked the absolute best casks because they only needed a small amount. Always follows an They only needed a small amount of those casks for the bottling, so they picked the absolute best ones. Whereas if you fast forward to now, you need to bring out a much bigger quantity. Therefore, you need a bigger number of casks. Therefore, there's more of a spread in terms of the quality. That was one perception. I'm not sure if that's 100% true. I've got to think that there's more attention being paid to wood management now than there ever was. But yet people seem to be drawn to these older bottlings from the 70s and the 80s where they say there was better style. I'm not sure. It's difficult to say. And there's a lot of the whiskies that you try today that you'll never find examples of from back then because they just weren't there. Even independent bottlers maybe didn't have them. So I don't know. But guys, this is a good time for any questions that anybody has. Now is the time.
I just have one question. The whiskey number 1, Linkwood.
Yes.
Maybe I missed what you said. Where is the area that is distilled?
So Linkwood is also from Speyside, and actually just outside Elgin. Elgin's one of the bigger towns in the northeast of Scotland, and Linkwood is just outside. And I meant to mention this before. I've had a relationship with Linkwood going back to my Burn Stewart days, because when I worked at Burn Stewart, you guys will know the fashion brand Burberry's. You know, Burberry's from London does like the check, and they used to have a whiskey. And when I worked at Burn Stewart, we had the rights to bottle and market the Burberry whiskey range, and it was mostly blended whiskey, and there was a gin, but they also had a single malt, a 15-year-old, and it came from Linkwood Distillery. And I remember even back then thinking that it was a great single malt, and that was before I really had much of an understanding of single malt whiskies. But yeah, Linkwood, just outside Elgin. As you're driving into Elgin, it's kind of on the east side.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? Come on, there must be some more questions. Anything, even if it's a silly question.
When's your next outrun?
So we're looking at either February or March. I'm kind of I'm a wee bit behind at the moment. I was hoping to bottle in February, but I've been trying to update my stock document with some of the re-racks that we did that I've just finished at the end of last year, and it takes a little bit of time to get all the information. I like to sit and look at this. This is typically how a bottling starts, is on a spreadsheet, and you'll sit and you'll kind of narrow it down to maybe 30 casks, and then you start looking at samples. Do I have a recent sample of that one? I'm going to have to get a sample of that one. So we're looking at February or March. I think March is now more likely. To be honest, this is one of the great things about being a small company and being your own boss. There is no rush. 4 weeks isn't going to make too much of a difference to me. So probably March. We're maybe going to do 7 or 8 casks this time. Typically, we're looking at doing 4 batches per year, and maybe a few customer exclusives. You know, maybe a couple of casks for Taiwan, a couple of casks for Japan, that type of thing. And this is the fun bit. I love picking the casks for a batch. That's the great thing. And I did look at this a few months ago, and I've probably 70% picked it. But you want to go back and just have another look and see what makes sense. But yeah, and it's always trying to find. You're always trying to bring in a couple of distilleries that you haven't done before, or a couple of types of cask that you haven't done before. So you're trying to keep it fresh. You don't want to be repetitive. So it's different distilleries, different ages, different cask types, different styles. That plus good quality whiskey. Those are the kind of things that we're looking for. But yeah, batch 6, February, March.
So there's one more question about the label. So who
Yes,
your label?
Oh, a little Scottish Italian guy called Benedetto Bordoni, who is a designer based in Glasgow. Is a guy that we did some work with when I was at Benriach. Good guy. That's his work. We were trying to go for a. Go on.
The guy name is
Benedetto. Are you Ben? You're Ben. Okay. So yeah, we were trying to go for like you know those sort of retro travel posters that you sometimes see. That was kind of the theme, and tying it in with this infrequent flyers with the airplane. So yeah, he's the guy. I find packaging development quite difficult. It's a very it's an arduous process. So now that we've got a label, we're probably going to stick with that for quite some time.
It's a nice one.
Question?
Any more questions for someone?
Yeah, I'd like to know how bad or good things turned because of the plague this year. Did it help? Yeah, how did it affect the business?
It didn't have a negative effect on sales. If anything, people seem to be drinking at home more often. And I think single malt is quite well suited towards drinking. I'm laughing at the cat. What have you? What? But single malt, I think, is quite well suited to drinking at home. And I think a lot of whiskey companies got some benefit from that. What we did find difficult back in March, April, was that a lot of places, a lot of bottling halls closed down, a lot of distillers closed down for maybe 6 weeks, 8 weeks. And it meant that if you were trying to get something bottled or if you were trying to move casks, it was actually quite difficult. You just couldn't do it. Our third batch, the bottling started in the first week of March, and then our bottler closed down for 6 weeks. So we didn't actually finish that until the end of May. So we just had like a 2-month period where we didn't have anything to sell. So there was nothing to do, just take it easy. But I think now what you're seeing in the current lockdown is that a lot of the businesses that had closed down last time are actually open this time. So you can still get your bottling done, you can still get your labels printed, you can still move casks from one location to another. What the biggest negative impact has been the inability to actually go and see people. You can't go and see your suppliers, you can't go and see your customers, you can't go and do a whiskey festival. You can do tastings online, but you obviously you can't do them face to face. And I think the industry is a people industry, and we are all missing the opportunity to get out and actually meet our customers and our colleagues from other companies. That's probably been the biggest thing, because that's where the fun is, and the fun part has been taken away.
That would make a frequent flyer out of you again, Alistair.
It will have to happen. I thought last year I was going to be flying all over the world. When I sat down in January last year, I was planning on trips to Japan, Taiwan, New Zealand, Australia, places in Europe. And
don't we all?
I know. And hopefully it's going to come back. Let me see, any plans to export to Israel? I've got to be honest, guys, the difficulty we have at the moment is we've got 9 markets, and it's difficult to bring on any new markets because it just dilutes the allocations. It's the problem with single casks. So at the moment, probably not, but who knows what might happen in the future. What I do think is amazing is people's ability to get products, even though it's not in their country. Everybody seems to find a source or a retailer that is going to ship to every country in the world. So I hope that if you do like the whiskies, you do have the ability to get them somehow, whether it's from a UK retailer or somebody else. If it's possible to expand our distribution, I will do it, but it's so difficult with the limitations by the outturns we get from the casks.
I'd
love to.
Question: How bad is trying to accelerate aging with wood chips?
Well, as far as I'm aware, we are not allowed to do it.
But in the US, they are.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it can have an effect. I'm sure it can have a positive effect. I've read of other processes that people are trying to say you can make a 10-year-old whiskey in 1 year, etc. I think when it comes to maturation, I'm a traditionalist, and I think you should stick by the rules. You know, you cannot replicate the influence of time. Time is time, and a 10-year maturation is a 10-year maturation. And if you want to get that effect, you have to just allow time to do its thing.
And then a follow-up. Me and Ira, which is the guy with the cat, we make beer.
Nice.
And I always thought it would be fun to try and distill it and make whiskey. And
now,
the question is, how bad would it be?
I don't think it would be bad. I think there are people that have done this. There are.
Yeah, it has been done also in Israel, Alistair, more than once.
Yeah.
The distillation of beer was done in Israel by Malka Beer. They distilled the blonde ale, I think, and also done by the Golan distillery, which they distilled beer from the Golan brewery, and also some beer made from chickpea. So it's not bad. It's a bit, hoppy, and it's very funky and nice. So it's nothing far-fetched.
Yeah, I mean, the process is the process of whiskey making, is quite similar to beer up to a stage. So it's not an illogical idea, and as you say, it has been done before. I love beer. I mean, I would quite happily have gotten into the beer industry. Unfortunately, in the UK, it's quite difficult to make any money from beer. But yeah, and there's a great questions popped up there about finishing in a porter beer cask. I absolutely love a porter. A nice dark, rich porter is one of my favorite types of beer. And I'm not sure that beer casks or beer barrels have been particularly successful in terms of whiskey maturation from ones that I've seen in the past. I think it's on the other way out. The inverse tends to work better when you take a beer and expose it to a whiskey cask or a rum cask. It can have quite a nice effect. But if you were going to put a whiskey in a beer cask, a porter would probably be the obvious choice. It's almost like the beer equivalent of a Pedro Jimenez sherry cask in terms of the big, rich, dark flavors. So yeah, I wouldn't mind doing that. That's probably one to look at. I need to check on the. I'm sure we are allowed to do that. There's some casks that we are allowed to use and some casks that we're not. I think beer is okay. Yeah, smoky porter would be good. Yeah. Used to work with a company in America when I was at Benriach called Anchor Steam. And Anchor Steam make a fantastic, if you ever get a chance to try the Anchor Steam porter from San Francisco, it's brilliant. But they were also a distiller. They had a distillery in the basement where they made old Potrero American whiskey, and also a gin. I can't remember the name of the gin. So they were a pretty cool company. That's just an aside. But if you like a porter, the Anchor Steam porter is one of the nicest ones I've tasted. If you can get that in Israel. So yeah, that's one for the list. A nice smoky porter barrel for finishing whiskey. Could be on the cards. Watch this space. Guys, any more questions? All good?
Okay. So looks like we're good, yeah. So
I wish you a better year this year in terms of marketing and sales and everything. And of course, I hope that Brexit doesn't wreck the export business. And I hope we can find your bottles in Israel one day.
Yes, fingers crossed. Thank you. Yeah, Brexit is. It's funny. For about 3 years, we talked about nothing but Brexit, and then coronavirus came along, and we forgot all about Brexit. I never thought anything would take Brexit off of the front page of the newspaper. But you never know what's coming round the corner. Listen, Brexit was not a good idea in my opinion, but it's done. I think the industry has dealt with bigger challenges than Brexit in the past. We move on, we deal with it, and we'll see. I'm sure we'll find out the little details of Brexit as we go now. But yeah. But listen, guys, thank you so much. It was an unexpected pleasure to be joining you tonight in Israel.
Thank you very much, Alistair. It was really interesting and insightful into the industry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
I must say it's funny though, because when I got the message asking if I could join on Tuesday, I have to say my diary is not very busy at the moment. So there's nowhere to go.
It was a good coincidence.
Yes, exactly.
No,
So
thank you very much, Alistair. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for the knowledge that you have shared with us. It was really one of the more interesting and more diverse tastings we've had in the last few weeks, and we've had quite a few. So really thanking you, and I hope, and I know we shall meet again, maybe online, maybe face to face when this is over, but we will be in touch definitely.
All right, guys, I will wish you all good night, and hopefully see you all again at some point.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Very nice.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
לא, אחלה טעימה.
אחלה טעימה.
כן, באמת טוב הפעם.
גל, מה העניינים, גל?
מה קורה? מה קורה ברחובות, ניסים?
לא רואים אותך.
איזה סגורה זה?
דיון מה ההגדרה של שרי בר.
ה-27 שנה היה בשבילי השיא של הערב.
תראה, אתה נשאר לך עוד דרינקים, אה?
איזה וויסקי.
איזה הכי אהבתם?
ה-27.
לודבק, איפה אתה נמצא?
אתה חייב מיקרופון.
אני גם הכי אהבתי את ה-27 שנה. תפסיק
יהודה!
די עם הגז מזגנים, די.
חבר'ה, אני לא יודע למה... האופני עדיין יושב...
אצלך דפוק.
שמתי אותו על מיוט, הורג אותנו.
תוריד אותו, הוא עושה חור במוח.
הוא מרביץ מטל.
מת.
מי עכשיו יביא לנו את ה-27 Secret Spice Side הזה?
וואלה, הוא פצצה, ה-27 פצצה.
כן, פצצה.
קיינג' מביא אותו, או מאסטר אוף מאלט.
בדקתי, אבל באמת טעימה טובה. גם הסיקרט אורקני פצצה.
כולם היו פצצה, תמיד יש איזו נפילה אחת או שתיים. פה כולם היו טובים.
אני את הטוחס לא אהבתי, לא דיבר אליי.
אני גם את הטוחס אהבתי.
טבע מיוחד, אבל מעבר לזה גם ריח מוזר וגם...
אני גם בדרך כלל לא אוהב פורט, וזה היה פורט מוצלח מאוד יחסית לפורט.
הצבע הזה היה מוזר, אבל הריח והטעם...
הזוי, כמו של פורט, אבל היה טעם טעים.
וויסקי ורוד זה טוב, מה?
מה זה?
וויסקי ורוד זה אחלה.
כמו שמפניה.
כן.
אני פתחתי עכשיו טוחרס של קיידן הדס.
איזה?
בן 8, סתם היה לי חשק אחרי הטוחרס הזה.
עד כדי כך אהבת.
פחות עשה לי את זה.
לא, היה נחמד, אני אוהב